In the mid-1970s, the Cold War was no longer defined by speeches or public threats. It was defined by numbers: speed, altitude, radar range, reaction time. And in those numbers, one Soviet aircraft stood out more than any other. The MiG-25 interceptor was not just another fighter. In Western intelligence reports, it was described as a machine that should not have been possible at the time. According to estimates, it could fly faster than Mach 3, climb higher than any NATO aircraft, and intercept targets long before they reached Soviet airspace. Some analysts believed it was maneuverable enough to threaten even the most advanced American fighters. Much of this fear was based on very limited information. The MiG-25 had first appeared publicly in the late 1960s. Western radar operators occasionally detected fast, high-altitude contacts over the Soviet Union. These flights were rare, brief, and deliberately ambiguous. No photographs, no wreckage, no pilot testimony, only radar traces and intelligence fragments. From those fragments, a myth began to form. Western analysts assumed the aircraft was built using advanced titanium alloys. They believed it carried sophisticated avionics and cutting-edge radar systems. Some reports even suggested it could outperform the American F-15, which at that time was still under development. The implications were serious. If the MiG-25 was as capable as believed, it meant the Soviet Union had achieved a major technological leap. It would shift the balance of air superiority and force NATO to accelerate weapons programs at enormous cost. Billions of dollars were allocated based partly on assumptions about this single aircraft. Inside the Soviet Union, the MiG-25 had a different reputation. It was powerful, yes, but also demanding. It was designed primarily as a high-speed interceptor, not a dogfighter. Its purpose was simple: climb fast, fly high, intercept bombers or reconnaissance aircraft, then return. Comfort, flexibility, and pilot convenience were secondary concerns. The aircraft was also tightly controlled. Only selected units operated it. Flights were planned carefully. Pilots were monitored. The aircraft rarely flew near borders, and when it did, procedures were strict. The MiG-25 was not just a weapon, it was a state secret, and that secrecy was absolute. Western intelligence agencies had no opportunity to examine a MiG-25 up close. No Allied country had access to one. No neutral state had ever seen it land. Everything known about the aircraft came from indirect observation. This made it one of the most mysterious military machines of its era. By 1976, the MiG-25 symbolized uncertainty, not just about Soviet technology, but about Soviet intentions. It represented what could not be verified, only feared. It shaped doctrines, budgets, and strategic planning across the Western world. What no one outside the Soviet Air Force expected was that this secrecy would soon end, not because of espionage, sabotage, or war, but because of a single pilot and a routine training flight. At the time, there was nothing to suggest that such a moment was approaching. The aircraft was flying. The system was functioning. The secret appeared secure. For now. Viktor Belenko did not look like a man preparing to defect. By Soviet standards, his career appeared stable. He was a trained military pilot, serving in an air defense unit in the Far East. He flew one of the most secret aircraft in the Soviet arsenal. From the outside, this alone suggested loyalty, reliability, and trust from the system. But the Soviet system was often better at assigning roles than understanding people. Belenko was not a political dissident. He was not under investigation. He was not being followed by security services. He had not written letters, spoken openly, or taken part in any organized opposition. There was no dramatic confrontation between him and the state. Instead, there was something quieter and more difficult to detect. Throughout his career, Belenko struggled with the rigid structure of Soviet military life. Promotions were slow and often disconnected from skill. Living conditions were poor, especially in remote regions. Housing was overcrowded, salaries were limited, and personal freedom was tightly controlled. Transfers were decided without discussion. Assignments could change overnight. A pilot could be moved thousands of kilometers away from family with little explanation. For many officers, this was normal. For Belenko, it was increasingly unbearable. He was an experienced pilot, but he felt trapped in a system that offered no meaningful future. His professional growth was limited, and his personal life was unstable. Access to information from outside the Soviet Union was minimal, but even fragments were enough to suggest that alternatives existed. Importantly, Belenko did not see himself as a hero or a symbol. He did not believe his actions would change history. He was not trying to send a political message. His decision was driven by something more basic: the desire to leave a system he no longer trusted and to take control of his own life. This made him dangerous in a way the Soviet system rarely anticipated. Security procedures were designed to detect conspiracies, communications, and ideological threats. They were not designed to detect quiet, individual resolve. A pilot who followed orders, showed up on time, and flew competently did not raise suspicion. And Belenko did exactly that. He continued to train. He continued to fly scheduled missions. He followed protocols. He blended into routine. Inside the unit, there was no indication that one of the most advanced aircraft in the Soviet Air Force was being flown by a man who had already decided to leave. The opportunity came not through careful planning over years, but through a combination of geography and routine. The Far East region was vast. Airspace was complex. Training flights were frequent. Weather conditions were unpredictable. Navigation errors, at least on paper, were plausible. A single aircraft flying off course could be explained briefly, and Belenko understood that window would be very small. He did not plan to disappear quietly. He planned to cross a border that was not meant to be crossed, alone, in an aircraft that was never supposed to land anywhere but on Soviet soil. At the moment his decision became irreversible, there would be no support, no second chance, and no guarantee of survival. But from the ground, from the command posts, from the radar stations, nothing looked unusual. The pilot was flying. The aircraft was airborne. The system saw nothing wrong, and that was the most dangerous part. On the morning of September 6, 1976, the day began without any special significance. The air defense unit to which Viktor Belenko was assigned was scheduled to conduct a routine training flight. Such flights were common and followed established procedures. Pilots took off as a group, executed assigned maneuvers, and returned to base. Nothing in the plan suggested deviation or risk. The aircraft assigned to Belenko was a MiG-25P interceptor. Its role in training exercises was well defined. The aircraft would climb rapidly, maintain high speed, and simulate interception scenarios. These profiles were familiar to both pilots and ground controllers. Deviations were noticeable but not immediately alarming, especially during complex maneuvers. Weather conditions that day were imperfect. Cloud cover reduced visibility, and atmospheric interference affected radar clarity. For air defense systems, such conditions were manageable but introduced uncertainty. This uncertainty created small windows in which abnormal behavior could be temporarily masked as technical or environmental noise. The flight began as expected. The group took off and climbed to altitude. Communication between pilots and ground control remained normal. Belenko followed instructions and maintained formation. From the perspective of radar operators and commanders, the exercise was proceeding according to plan. At a predetermined moment, Belenko altered his flight profile. He reduced altitude and adjusted speed. This change alone was not extraordinary. Training scenarios often required pilots to simulate evasive maneuvers or transitions between flight modes. For a brief period, the deviation could be interpreted as part of the exercise. Lower altitude had a specific purpose. By descending, Belenko reduced the likelihood of continuous radar tracking. Terrain, atmospheric conditions, and the limitations of ground-based systems created gaps in coverage. At low altitude, the aircraft could move undetected for short intervals. Navigation now became critical. Belenko relied on internal instruments and prior knowledge of the region. His goal was to maintain a heading that would take him toward Japanese airspace without triggering immediate interception. The margin for error was small. A miscalculation could result in fuel exhaustion, interception by Soviet fighters, or an emergency landing in hostile territory. Fuel was a constant constraint. The MiG-25 was not designed for long-range flight. At high speed, fuel consumption increased rapidly. Belenko adjusted his speed to balance range and detection risk, avoiding both maximum velocity and prolonged loitering. As minutes passed, ground control began to notice irregularities. Radar contact became inconsistent. Communication attempts were made. Initially, these were procedural, requests for confirmation, position checks, routine queries. At this stage, there was no certainty that something was wrong. By the time concern escalated, options were limited. Interceptors could be scrambled, but response time mattered. Air defense systems relied on layered coordination, and uncertainty delayed decisive action. Within that delay, Belenko crossed a line that was not marked on the ground, but carried immense significance. He left Soviet airspace. The transition was not dramatic. There was no visible boundary, no immediate reaction. The aircraft continued flying, unchanged in appearance or function. Yet, politically and militarily, the situation had shifted completely. Ahead lay Japanese-controlled airspace. Belenko now faced a different set of risks. Japanese radar systems could identify him as an intruder. Air defense fighters could be launched. Communication barriers, lack of clearance, and unfamiliar procedures increased the possibility of a fatal misunderstanding. The aircraft was low on fuel. There was no opportunity to circle or divert. A landing would have to occur quickly on the first viable runway available. As Belenko approached the Japanese island of Hokkaido, he prepared for an unscheduled landing that no one on either side had planned. The training flight was over. What followed would transform a routine exercise into one of the most consequential defections of the Cold War. As Viktor Belenko approached Japanese airspace, the situation became increasingly constrained by time. Fuel levels were critically low. The MiG-25 had not been designed for extended flight, and the adjustments made earlier to reduce detection had consumed more fuel than a standard training profile. There would be no opportunity to search for an optimal landing site or wait for instructions. Belenko's primary objective was simple: land the aircraft intact. Japanese radar systems detected the intruding aircraft shortly after it entered controlled airspace. From the Japanese perspective, the situation was unclear. An unidentified military jet was approaching at speed, without prior clearance and without established communication. Japanese air defense units were placed on alert. However, the MiG-25's rapid approach and low altitude limited response options. Scrambling interceptors and establishing visual contact would take time that Belenko did not have. Ahead lay Hakodate Airport, a civilian airfield on the island of Hokkaido. It was not designed for military interceptors. Its runway was shorter than what the MiG-25 normally required, especially at the aircraft's landing weight and speed. There were also civilian aircraft, personnel, and infrastructure present, increasing the risk of collision or overrun. Despite these limitations, Hakodate represented the only viable option. Belenko descended and aligned with the runway. The landing was aggressive and imprecise by standard aviation criteria. The aircraft touched down at high speed, consuming the entire runway length. It overshot the paved surface and came to a stop on soft ground beyond the runway. The MiG-25 was damaged, but largely intact. For airport personnel and local authorities, the scene was unprecedented. A Soviet military jet, bearing Red Star insignia, had landed without warning at a civilian airport. Initial reactions were cautious and confused. Language barriers and procedural uncertainty slowed communication. Belenko exited the aircraft and made clear, through gestures and limited verbal communication, that he was seeking asylum. Japanese authorities secured the area and restricted access to the aircraft. Within hours, the situation escalated beyond local control. The Japanese government informed its allies, and diplomatic channels were activated. The Soviet Union reacted quickly. Moscow demanded the immediate return of both the aircraft and the pilot, describing the incident as a navigational error. Official statements emphasized that the MiG-25 had entered Japanese airspace accidentally and that the pilot had no intention of defecting. These claims were treated with skepticism. Belenko was separated from the aircraft and placed under protection. Interviews were conducted with translators present. His request for asylum was formally recorded. At the same time, American intelligence specialists were notified and preparations were made to examine the aircraft. The MiG-25 was transported to a secure facility for inspection. For the first time, Western engineers and analysts had direct access to an aircraft that had shaped military planning for nearly a decade. The secrecy surrounding the interceptor was about to be replaced with measurement, disassembly, and documentation. What began as an unplanned landing at a regional airport had become a strategic event. The consequences would extend far beyond the fate of a single pilot. Once the MiG-25 was secured, attention shifted from the pilot to the machine itself. For Western intelligence agencies, this was an opportunity that had not existed before. For years, assessments of the MiG-25 had been based on indirect data, radar signatures, flight profiles, and limited photographic evidence. Now, the aircraft was physically present and available for detailed examination. The inspection process was methodical. Engineers documented the structure, materials, avionics, radar systems, and weapons interfaces. Components were measured, weighed, and compared against existing intelligence estimates. What emerged from this analysis differed significantly from the image that had dominated Western planning. The MiG-25 was powerful, but not sophisticated in the way many had assumed. Rather than extensive use of titanium, much of the aircraft was constructed from high-strength steel. This made the aircraft heavy, but also robust and easier to manufacture at scale. The design emphasized straight-line speed and altitude performance over maneuverability. Avionics systems were functional but relatively simple. The radar was effective for its intended role, long-range interception, but lacked the flexibility and processing power attributed to it in earlier assessments. Electronic components relied heavily on vacuum tubes rather than advanced solid-state electronics, a choice that improved resistance to radiation but increased size and weight. This design philosophy reflected a specific doctrine. The MiG-25 was not meant to engage in complex air combat. It was designed to intercept high-altitude targets such as strategic bombers or reconnaissance aircraft, execute its mission quickly, and return to base. In that role, it performed exactly as intended. For Western planners, this was a revelation. The aircraft was neither the technological miracle nor the overwhelming threat it had been assumed to be. At the same time, it was not inferior or obsolete. It represented a different set of priorities: speed, altitude, and simplicity over versatility. These findings had immediate consequences. Some Western weapons programs were reassessed. Assumptions about Soviet air combat capabilities were revised. The urgency surrounding certain interceptor and missile projects was reduced, while attention shifted toward aircraft optimized for maneuverability and electronic warfare. For the Soviet Union, the implications were severe. The exposure of the MiG-25's design forced changes across the fleet. Avionics systems were updated, security procedures were tightened, training protocols were reviewed. The loss was not only technical but symbolic. A core element of strategic uncertainty had been removed. After the inspection was completed, the aircraft was returned to the Soviet Union in dismantled form. By then, its value as a secret had already been lost. The MiG-25 continued to serve for years, but it no longer occupied the same position in Western imagination. The fear it once generated was replaced by understanding, and understanding altered the balance more effectively than speculation ever had. The cost of that shift could not be measured in a single budget line. It was paid in doctrine, credibility, and strategic advantage. After the inspection of the MiG-25 was completed, attention returned to the pilot who had delivered it. Viktor Belenko was transferred to the United States after a brief stay in Japan. His request for asylum was approved, and he was placed under the protection of American authorities. For Western intelligence services, his value lay not only in the aircraft he had flown, but in his direct experience inside the Soviet military system. Belenko was questioned extensively. He provided details about training procedures, air defense protocols, pilot routines, and organizational culture within Soviet aviation units. His testimony confirmed much of what analysts had suspected and clarified areas that had previously been based on assumption rather than evidence. At the same time, his situation was tightly controlled. Public appearances were limited, information was filtered. The goal was not publicity, but assessment. Once that process was complete, Belenko was allowed to begin a civilian life in the United States. In the Soviet Union, the response was swift and absolute. Belenko was declared a traitor and sentenced in absentia. His name was removed from official records. His family faced pressure and isolation, a common consequence in cases involving defection. Official explanations framed the incident as a criminal act motivated by personal weakness rather than systemic failure. The event triggered internal consequences. Security procedures for elite aircraft were tightened. Pilots assigned to sensitive platforms were screened more aggressively. Training flights near borders were reevaluated. The assumption that loyalty could be inferred from silence and routine was no longer sufficient. Strategically, the damage could not be undone. The MiG-25 was no longer an unknown quantity. Western planners adjusted their assessments, budgets, and doctrines accordingly. The aircraft continued to serve, but its psychological impact had been neutralized. For Belenko, the outcome was more ambiguous. He gained freedom of movement and personal autonomy, but lost his homeland permanently. He could not return. His previous life was effectively erased. Like many defectors, he occupied a space between systems, no longer part of the one he left, never fully integrated into the one he entered. The flight itself lasted less than an hour. Its consequences lasted decades. No weapons were fired, no borders were visibly breached, no battle took place. Yet the incident altered military planning, intelligence assessments, and perceptions on both sides of the Cold War divide. It demonstrated that even the most controlled systems remain vulnerable to individual action, not through force, but through access. One aircraft, one pilot, one decision. That was enough